October 1929. The stock market crashes, fortunes vanish, panic spreads. History remembers this as the beginning of the Great Depression, but history is wrong. The crash was a symptom, a warning sign, a crack in the facade. The real catastrophe, the decision that transformed a financial panic into a decade-long economic nightmare affecting the entire world, came 6 months later, the 17th of June 1930. President Herbert Hoover, against the advice of over 1,000 economists who begged him to veto, signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law. This wasn't just another tariff. It was the highest peacetime tariff in American history, raising rates on over 20,000 imported goods. Within months, 25 countries retaliated with their own tariffs. Global trade collapsed by 66% between 1929 and 1934. Credit markets seized. Currency wars erupted. An economic downturn that might have been contained became a worldwide catastrophe. Unemployment in America hit 25%. Banks failed by the thousands. The Dust Bowl devastated agriculture already crushed by collapsing export markets. And much of this devastation traces back to a single piece of protectionist legislation that most people have never heard of. This is the story of how good intentions, political expediency, and economic ignorance combined to ignite the Great Depression. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff didn't emerge from nowhere. It was born from agricultural desperation and political calculation in the 1920 seconds. American farmers, who had prospered during World War I selling food to Europe, faced collapse as European agriculture recovered. Prices for wheat, corn, and cotton plummeted. Farmers who'd borrowed heavily to expand during the war boom couldn't service debts. Rural banks failed. The agricultural depression of the 1920 seconds preceded the General Depression by nearly a decade. Farmers demanded protection. If they couldn't compete with cheaper foreign agricultural products, then tariffs should shield them. This logic, economically flawed but politically powerful, drove Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon to craft legislation ostensibly helping farmers. But once the tariff bill opened for debate in 1929, every industry demanded its own protection. Textiles wanted tariffs on imported fabrics, steel wanted protection from European competition, chemicals, glass, leather, every sector sought shelter from foreign goods. The final bill, initially focused on agriculture, metastasized into comprehensive protectionism covering virtually everything America imported. Tariff rates on over 20,000 items were raised, with some increases reaching 100% or more. The average tariff rate on dutiable imports rose to approximately 53% according to historical analysis, the highest level since the 1820 seconds. This wasn't moderate adjustment. This was economic warfare disguised as domestic policy. As the bill moved through Congress in 1929 and early 1930, opposition mounted from an unexpected source: economists. On the 4th of May 1930, 1028, economists signed a petition urging President Hoover to veto the legislation. The petition, organized by economist Paul Douglas, who would later become a U.S. Senator, warned in stark terms that the tariff would raise living costs for Americans, damage U.S. export industries, and provoke foreign retaliation. The economists understood what politicians ignored. Trade is reciprocal. When you stop buying from other countries, they stop buying from you. Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan warned Hoover that the tariff would be catastrophic for international finance. Henry Ford publicly opposed it. The American Bankers Association urged veto. 36 countries formally protested before the bill became law, threatening retaliation. Even within Hoover's own party, prominent Republicans opposed it. This wasn't obscure academic theory. This was practical understanding that the tariff would devastate the economy. Hoover understood the risks. He'd lived in Europe. He'd seen how interconnected the global economy had become. He knew the tariff was bad policy. But he was a politician facing midterm elections. The Republican Party had campaigned on tariff protection. Farmers, a core constituency, demanded it. Hoover calculated that signing a bad bill was better than fighting his own party. On the 17th of June, 1930, despite all warnings, he signed. The economists had lost. The consequences would be catastrophic. The retaliation came swiftly. Canada, America's largest trading partner, immediately imposed retaliatory tariffs. Within months, Italy increased tariffs on American cars. Switzerland boycotted American products. Spain passed the Weiss tariff in 1931. Germany raised agricultural tariffs. France erected trade barriers. By 1932, 25 countries had enacted retaliatory measures specifically targeting American goods. The global trading system already weakened. By the 1929 crash, collapsed into tit-for-tat protectionism. The numbers tell the story of destruction. U.S. exports fell from $5.2 billion in 1929 to $1.6 billion in 1933, a decline of approximately 70%. Imports fell similarly, from $4.4 billion to $1.3 billion. World trade contracted by approximately 66% between 1,929 and 1,934, according to League of Nations data. This wasn't just American trade collapsing, this was global commerce grinding to a halt as every nation erected barriers to protect industries that could no longer export because everyone else had erected barriers too. The agricultural sector, which the tariff was supposedly designed to protect, suffered devastating losses. American farm exports collapsed, wheat exports fell by approximately 75%. Cotton exports dropped by nearly 2/3. European countries, unable to sell industrial goods to America because of the tariff, couldn't afford to buy American agricultural products even if they wanted to. The tariff destroyed the market it was meant to protect. The banking sector faced a cascade of failures. Banks in agricultural regions, already weakened by farm distress, collapsed as export markets vanished. Banks that had financed international trade found those loans worthless as trade stopped. European banks, dependent on American lending to service World War I debts, faced liquidity crises. The Kreditanstalt, Austria's largest bank, failed in May 1931, triggering a European banking crisis. Germany suspended reparation payments. Britain abandoned the gold standard in September 1931. The international financial architecture, already strained, shattered. The unemployment explosion wasn't just American. U.S. unemployment reached approximately 25% by 1933. But Germany saw unemployment hit 30%. Britain exceeded 20%. The Depression became global precisely because trade collapsed globally. When countries can't trade, industries close, workers lose jobs, demand falls, creating a downward spiral that national policies alone can't reverse. Economists debate how much responsibility Smoot-Hawley bears for the Depression's depth and duration. Some argue the tariff was a relatively minor factor, that the Federal Reserve's monetary policy failures and the gold standard's constraints mattered more. This view has merit. The Fed allowed the money supply to contract by 1/3, a catastrophic policy mistake. The gold standard forced deflationary policies across the world. These factors deepened the Depression independent of tariffs. But this argument misses the crucial international dimension. The 1929 crash was American. It could have been contained as a painful but manageable recession, affecting primarily the U.S. What made it a global catastrophe was the collapse of international trade and finance. And that collapse was directly triggered by Smoot-Hawley and the retaliatory spiral it unleashed. Contemporary accounts and historical analysis suggest the tariff transformed a crisis into a catastrophe. The political economy perspective reveals how Smoot-Hawley destroyed international cooperation. During the 1920 seconds, despite tensions over war debts and reparations, countries had cooperated on economic management. Central banks coordinated to support the gold standard. The League of Nations facilitated trade discussions. Smoot-Hawley shattered this cooperation. When America, the world's largest economy and creditor nation, abandoned free trade principles and enacted extreme protectionism, it signaled that nationalism had triumphed over internationalism. Other countries responded in kind, each pursuing beggar-thy-neighbor policies that impoverished everyone. The tariff's impact on specific industries reveals the folly. American automakers supported the tariff to protect against European imports. Then Canada raised tariffs on American cars. Ford's Canadian exports collapsed. General Motors faced similar retaliation. The industry that sought protection ended up worse off because retaliation destroyed larger export markets than domestic protection created. This pattern repeated across sectors. Every industry that gained domestic protection lost foreign markets, usually resulting in net job losses despite the supposed protection. The developing world suffered particularly acutely. Countries in Latin America, Asia, and Eastern Europe depended on exporting raw materials and agricultural products to industrialized nations. When trade barriers went up and global commerce collapsed, these economies faced catastrophic terms of trade shocks. Brazil couldn't sell coffee, Argentina couldn't sell wheat or beef. Chile's copper exports collapsed. These countries then couldn't import manufactured goods, couldn't service debts, and spiraled into default and depression. The global nature of the Depression reflected the global nature of trade's collapse. The political consequences extended beyond economics. Economic desperation fueled extremism. In Germany, the Depression created the conditions for Hitler's rise. Unemployment, poverty, and a sense that the democratic system couldn't solve economic problems drove voters to the Nazi Party. Hitler's 1,933 accession to power came after years of depression conditions that the trade collapse had worsened. While many factors contributed to fascism's rise, the economic chaos that trade wars created was fundamental. In America, Smoot-Hawley became politically toxic. The 1,930 midterm elections saw Republicans lose heavily. The 1,932 presidential election brought Franklin Roosevelt to power in a landslide. Roosevelt initially continued protectionist policies, but by 1934, under Secretary of State Cordell Hull's influence, began moving toward trade liberalization. The Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 gave the president authority to negotiate tariff reductions with other countries. This gradual reversal of Smoot-Hawley's protectionism helped international trade begin recovering, though full recovery took years. The lesson that should have been learned, that protectionism triggers retaliation and destroys prosperity for everyone, took time to sink in. After World War II, policymakers explicitly designed the Bretton Woods system and what became the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to prevent another Smoot-Hawley disaster. The post-war trading system, for all its flaws, understood that open trade benefits all participants while trade wars harm everyone. For 70 years after the Depression, that lesson held. But memory fades. By the 2010 seconds and 2020 seconds, protectionist sentiment returned. Politicians again claimed that tariffs would protect industries and bring back jobs. Trade wars with China saw both countries imposing escalating tariffs. The rhetoric echoed the 1,930 seconds. We're being taken advantage of. We need to protect our industries. Trade deficits are destroying us. The economists, like in 1930, warned that tariffs would harm the economy. The warnings, like in 1930, were largely ignored. The parallels are disturbing. When President Trump imposed tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Chinese goods in 2018 to 2019, retaliation came immediately. China targeted American agricultural products. Europe hit American whiskey and motorcycles. Canada retaliated against multiple sectors. U.S. farmers, who'd supported Trump, found themselves devastated by Chinese tariffs. The government had to provide tens of billions in agricultural subsidies to offset losses from retaliation, essentially taxing consumers through tariffs and using the money to pay farmers for lost exports. It was economically destructive and politically driven, just like Smoot-Hawley. In 2025, with new tariff proposals approaching or exceeding Smoot-Hawley levels according to some analyses, the risk of repeating history looms large. Economists again warn that high tariffs will trigger retaliation, increase consumer costs, and damage economic growth. Business groups again express concern. Foreign countries again threaten countermeasures. The pattern repeats because the political incentives that drove Smoot-Hawley, appearing to protect domestic industries regardless of economic consequences, remain powerful. The fundamental economics haven't changed since 1930. Trade is mutually beneficial. When countries specialize based on comparative advantage and trade freely, total wealth increases. Tariffs reduce this wealth by forcing countries to produce things inefficiently domestically rather than importing them from efficient foreign producers. Consumers pay higher prices. Producers face higher input costs. The protected industries might benefit in the short term, but retaliation costs them export markets. The net effect is negative. Smoot-Hawley proved this theorem with the largest real-world experiment in history. The United States, the world's largest economy, imposed massive tariffs. The result was global economic catastrophe. Trade collapsed, employment fell, living standards plummeted. The depression that might have been a painful but temporary correction became a decade-long nightmare. And the political instability that economic desperation created led directly to World War II. The cost of that single tariff bill, measured in lost prosperity and ultimately in lives lost in war, was incalculable. Some historians argue that Smoot-Hawley receives disproportionate blame, that its contribution to the Depression, while real, was smaller than mythology suggests. They point to the 1929 crash, the Fed's failures, and the gold standard as more important factors. This debate will continue among scholars. But what's undeniable is that the tariff made things worse at exactly the wrong time. It transformed an American financial crisis into a global economic catastrophe by destroying the mechanism, international trade, that could have facilitated recovery. The lesson isn't that tariffs are always wrong. Strategic tariffs for national security or to counter unfair trade practices might be justified. But broad, high tariffs imposed during economic stress, marketed as protecting workers but actually protecting politically connected industries, inevitably backfire. They invite retaliation. They raise costs. They reduce economic efficiency. They harm the very workers they claim to protect by destroying export markets and raising the cost of living. Smoot-Hawley stands as the textbook example of disastrous economic policy born from political expediency and nationalist short-sightedness. 1,028 economists warned it would fail. They were right. The bill passed anyway, and the world paid the price for a decade. If we're determined to repeat that mistake, at least we should do so with eyes open to the historical precedent. The tariff that ignited the Great Depression wasn't the cause of every problem in the 1,930 seconds, but it was the match that turned a manageable fire into an uncontrollable inferno. Understanding that might be crucial as we face choices about trade policy today. If this changed how you see the Great Depression and the dangers of trade wars, hit that subscribe button. The most devastating policies often seem reasonable in the moment, promise simple solutions to complex problems, and ignore warnings from experts who understand the consequences. Smoot-Hawley was that policy. The lesson is timeless. Whether we learn from it remains to be seen.